The trading post hung in space like a rusted jewel. Its docking arms stretched out to catch ships from a dozen different worlds, and Kai Merrick guided his junker through the debris field with practiced ease. The hull groaning under stress it was never meant to endure but somehow always did, and the vessel was a patchwork of stolen parts and desperate repairs. Held together by welds that would make any legitimate engineer weep. 3 centuries had passed since the Vrin Collective found Earth. Since they looked down at the dying world with its polluted skies and endless wars and decided humanity was barely worth the paperwork, and the annexation had been swift and brutal. Stripping the planet for resources while scattering survivors across labor colonies that stretched from one end of council space to the other, and now Kai was the last one free, or at least the last one who mattered. Drifting through the shattered belt and picking through wreckage for anything worth selling, though. Docking clamps seized his ship with a metallic shriek, and Kai killed the engines, running through the shutdown sequence by muscle memory while his mind calculated how little credit remained in his account and how much he needed for fuel and basic supplies, and the math never worked in his favor, but somehow he always found a way to keep flying. He sealed his environment suit and cycled through the airlock, stepping into the trading post's main corridor where the artificial gravity felt too heavy after days in microgravity in the air, tasted, recycled, and stale. Filtered through systems that had seen better decades, and species from across the galaxy moved through the crowded space. Vrin with their chitinous plates and clicking mandibles. The towering Kresh with their forearms and crystalline eyes. The serpentine Delthera, who moved like oil through water. Kai kept his head down and moved toward the supply depot, knowing that being human meant being invisible until someone decided to notice you, and then it meant being entertainment or a target or both, and he had learned over the years how to navigate that razor edge, how to be forgettable while still getting what he needed. But luck was a finite resource, and today his head run dry. The first blow came from behind, a calculated shove that sent him sprawling across the deck, and laughter erupted around him. The harsh clicking sounds of Vrin, amusement, mixing with the deeper rumbles of other species, and Kai rolled to his feet in time to see 3 Vrin enforcers blocking his path. Their black armor marked with the red sigils of the Collective Security Force. "Look what we have here," the lead enforcer clicked, his translator rendering the words in flat galactic standard, and his name was Vex, according to the nameplate on his chest, and he was large even for a Vrin. His plate scarred from what looked like decades of violence, and the last little human. Crawling through our station like the vermin he is, Kai said nothing and kept his expression neutral, his hands visible and unthreatening, while his mind raced through options, and none of them were good, because security force enforcers could do whatever they wanted to someone like him. And the council would never question it. "I asked you a question. Human." They stepped closer, and his companions spread out to cut off any escape route in what brings trash like you to a respectable establishment. "Just here for supplies," Kai said quietly, and his voice steady, despite the fear coiling in his gut, "and I'll be gone as soon as I refuel." "You'll be gone when I say you can go." Vex's mandibles spread in what passed for a smile among his kind and cruel, but first, "I think you owe us some entertainment, and get on your knees." The crowd had grown larger now. Dozens of beings forming a loose circle to watch, and some looked uncomfortable. But none moved to intervene, because that was how it worked in council. Space and humans were at the bottom of every hierarchy that mattered, and Kai felt the weight of their stares. The casual cruelty of beings who saw him as less than nothing he thought about, resisting, and his muscles tensed with the urge to fight back. But that would only make it worse. And he had survived this long by knowing when to bend and when to break, and so he lowered himself to his knees. Feeling the cold deck through his suit and tasting humiliation like copper in his mouth. "Good human." X clicked in satisfaction, and one of his companions was recording this, broadcasting it to the galactic net, where millions would watch and laugh. "And now beg for your supplies, and maybe we'll let you have them." Something shifted in Kai's chest, a coldness spreading through his veins that had nothing to do with the station's climate controls, and he had been humiliated before, had learned to swallow his pride and survive because that was what the last human did. But there were Limits to what flesh and blood could endure, and limits to what the human spirit would accept before it broke, or, transformed into something else entirely. He looked up at Dex and met the Enforcer's compound eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was different, harder and carrying an edge that made several nearby beings step back instinctively. "You just woke the Reaper," Kai said in English, the ancient language of dead Earth that none of these beings understood, and the words were simple, but they carried the weight of something far older than the Vryn Collective, older than the Council, older than the peaceful galaxy that had never known what humanity truly was. Thex's translator sputtered over the unfamiliar words and failed to render them into galactic standard, and the Enforcer clicked in annoyance and speak properly. Vermin, but Kai was done speaking, and he lowered his head in what looked like submission, and the Enforcers laughed and moved on. Satisfied with their entertainment, and the crowd dispersed, already forgetting the insignificant human who had provided a few minutes of amusement, and Kai remained kneeling for a long moment, breathing slowly and feeling something ancient stirring in the back of his mind. Circuits and code and buried memories beginning to wake. He stood eventually and completed his supply run with mechanical efficiency, his face blank and his movements precise, and the depot attendant barely looked at him as she processed his credit chip and loaded his purchases onto a grav cart, and Kai pushed it back to his ship, sealed himself inside, and waited for nightfall. The trading post operated on a 26-hour cycle to accommodate the various species that used it, and at hour 19, when most of the station's inhabitants were in their sleep cycles, Kai emerged from his ship wearing a maintenance worker's uniform he had stolen years ago, and no one looked twice at another faceless technician as he made his way through the service corridors toward the enforcement wing. The explosive device he assembled was simple, built from components any scavenger would have on hand, but placed with precision that spoke to knowledge Kai had not consciously known he possessed, and his hands moved with absolute certainty, attaching the charge to the fuel coupling of Dex's personal transport and setting a timer that would give him 3 hours to be far away. He was back in his ship and clearing the docking clamps when the explosion tore through the enforcement wing. A brief flash of light and fire that consumed Dex's vessel and scattered debris across 6 docking bays, and alarms shrieked, an emergency bulkhead slammed down, and Kai's junker slipped into the debris field like a ghost, its transponder already scrubbed and replaced with a false signature as he accelerated away from the station. Kai felt the coldness in his chest spreading, felt neural pathways lighting up that had been dormant for 3 decades since his implantation, and he did not fully understand what was happening to him, but he understood enough somewhere in the depths of his mind. A protocol was activating, and a purpose was emerging from 3 centuries of carefully buried code, and the galaxy had spent 300 years ridiculing humanity, dismissing them as primitive and self-destructive and weak. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. Behind him, the trading post receded into the darkness, and ahead lay the vast expanse of the shattered belt where a scavenger could disappear for months or years. And Kai set his course deep into the debris field and began accessing files he did not remember having, information flowing into his consciousness like water into a dry riverbed. Archives were opening, and the Reaper was waking, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Vryn Collective's investigation began 48 hours after the explosion, and Commander Zelix stood in what remained of the enforcement wing, her mandibles clicking in frustration as forensic teams sifted through the wreckage, and the blast pattern was wrong, too precise and too clean for a fuel system failure, and the timing too convenient given that Enforcer Thex and his entire unit had been aboard when the vessel erupted security footage. She demanded, and her subordinate gestured helplessly at the burned-out surveillance hub. All data for that sector was corrupted 6 minutes before the explosion. The technician reported, and his plates rattling with nervous energy, and we're looking at a sophisticated attack. Commander and whoever did this knew our systems. Zelix accessed the station's visitor logs and began cross-referencing departures. With the explosion timeline and 36 vessels had cleared the docking zone within the critical window, but one entry made her pause, and a human scavenger Registered under the name Chimeric, piloting a junker that barely qualified as spaceworthy, and Vex had filed a harassment report just hours before his death, noting that he had disciplined a human at the trading depot. Find this Merrick. Zelix ordered, and already knowing it was futile because the shattered belt swallowed ships and never gave them back unless it chose to, and I want every enforcement vessel in 3 sectors searching for him. But even as she gave the orders, Zelix felt a creeping unease that had nothing to do with the investigation itself, and humans were jokes. The galaxy's cautionary tale about species that destroyed themselves before reaching maturity, and yet someone had just struck at the collective with surgical precision and vanished without a trace deep in the shattered belt. Kai floated in his pilot's chair and watched data stream across his neural interface and languages. He was only beginning to remember, and the archives of Terra had been waiting for 3 centuries, hidden in quantum encryption so sophisticated that the collective's best systems could never have found them, and each activated Reaper carried a piece of the key. Their neural implants designed to unlock the database when triggered by specific trauma responses, humiliation and rage, and the threat of permanent enslavement. Enslavement and the emotional cocktail had been calculated centuries ago by minds that understood human psychology at its deepest levels, and Kai's activation had been inevitable from the moment that collective decided to mock him. Publicly, the archives revealed what the galaxy had never understood about humanity's fall, and Earth had not lost. A war with the Vryn, and they had been betrayed from within. Collaborators who believed that subjugation was better than extinction, and who helped the collective dismantle Earth's defenses in exchange for promises of survival that were never kept, and the true human military, the ones who understood what was coming, had fought a desperate rearguard action not to win, but to buy time to activate Project Replicae, absorb the information with a clarity that terrified him, and his implants were more than just training. They were a complete restructuring of his neural architecture, transforming him from a scavenger barely surviving into something the galaxy had not seen in 300 years in a human. Soldier operating at full capacity, the archives contained everything in tactical databases spanning 10,000 years of human warfare. From ancient blade combat to the nuclear exchanges that nearly destroyed Earth twice, and psychological warfare techniques refined across countless cultures and conflicts, and logistical knowledge for conducting insurgencies that could last decades or centuries, and most importantly, they contained the locations of 47 other sleeper agents. Scattered across Council space, Kai accessed the activation protocols and felt a moment of hesitation, because waking the others would mean committing to a path that could only end in freedom or extinction, and there would be no middle ground. No return to the shadows, he thought of Dex's mandibles, spreading in cruel amusement, and of 3 centuries of humans worked to death in labor colonies, and of an Earth stripped bare and left to choke on its own pollution, while the collectives, ships carried away everything of value. Kai activated the protocol across 12 sectors. In mining facilities and recycling plants and maintenance stations and agricultural colonies, humans began to wake, and some of them were old. Gray-haired men and women who had lived quiet lives of servitude, and others were young, born into slavery, and never knowing freedom, and all of them felt the same coldness spreading through their chests as neural implants came online and turned them into weapons. They did not act immediately, and that was part of the design, because Reaper Protocol was not about rage or revenge, and it was about systematic dismantling of enemy infrastructure, using patience and precision that species like the Vryn could not comprehend in the Calyx sector. A human maintenance worker named Sarah Chen began studying the power grid of the processing facility where she had worked for 17 years, and her implants fed her schematics and analysis tools, and she saw weaknesses that had always been there, but that she had never known to look for in the Mordith colonies. A human named James Ko, who had spent 30 years hauling, or began observing the patrol patterns of the Vryn overseers, and his enhanced perception cataloged every routine, every deviation, and every exploitable habit in the Vryn home system itself. A human janitor named Leo Wei, who cleaned the floors of the collective's central data. Archive began mapping the security systems with eyes that now saw in ways human eyes were never meant to see, moved through their days with the same beaten expressions they'd always worn, but at night they accessed the archives and learned and planned and waited for the signal that would begin the real Workeye spent 3 weeks in the belt, studying and absorbing and transforming himself from activated Reaper into operational commander, and the archives designated him as Cell Leader Theta 7, a rank that had been assigned before his birth by strategists who had never known his name but had known that someone like him would be needed when he finally emerged from the belt. His junker looked the same from the outside, but everything within had changed, and the cargo hold was no longer filled with scavenged junk, but with carefully selected materials that could be assembled into tools the galaxy had forgotten were possible. And Kai's first target was a Vrin communications relay on the outer edge of the Zelthera sector. The station processed data traffic for 8 nearby systems, and its destruction would blind the Collective's enforcement network for weeks while they rerouted through backup facilities, and Kai studied the station for 3 days from a distance, learning its rhythms and its vulnerabilities, and on the 4th night he drifted close in a stolen maintenance pod and attached a series of charges to the main transmission Aratha. Explosion was beautiful in its precision and cascading failures that spread through the station's systems like a virus, and by the time the crew understood what was happening, half their communications capacity was gone, and Kai was back in his ship and accelerating away into the darkness. Collective blamed equipment failure initially, but when a second relay exploded 6 days later on the opposite side of their territory, Commander Zelix began seeing patterns in 2 attacks, both on communications infrastructure, and both executed with intimate knowledge of Vrin. System She pulled up the files on human capabilities and read reports that were 3 centuries old, and they described humans as technologically inferior, strategically unsophisticated, and prone to emotional decision-making that made them easy to predict and manipulate. Teslix clicked her mandibles and thought, began to wonder if those assessments had been accurate, or if they had been exactly what the humans wanted the Collective to believe on the 3rd week. Sarah Chen disabled the power grid at her processing facility with a cascading overload that took 16 hours to repair, and no one suspected the quiet maintenance worker who helped frantically restore systems, and 2 days later, James Coe caused a mining crawler to malfunction and crush 3 Vrin overseers in what looked like a tragic accident. Wei copied 17 terabytes of classified data from the Central Archive and transmitted it through channels so obscure that the Collective would not discover the breach for months across Council space. The Reapers were waking and moving and striking, and each attack was small enough to seem random, but together they formed a pattern that military analysts began to notice with growing alarm. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries mocking humanity, and they were about to discover what humanity had been doing during those centuries. They had been watching and learning and waiting, and now the hunt had begun. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 6 weeks after the attacks began, and representatives from 43 species filled the massive chamber that orbited the neutral world of Axis Prime, and the Vrin delegation stood at the central podium, their mandibles clicking rapid-fire translations that the chamber systems rendered into hundreds of languages simultaneously. "We are facing coordinated terrorism," High Commander Vexeth declared, and her plates darkened with agitation, and 17 major infrastructure attacks. 43 casualties. Economic damage exceeding 2 trillion credits, and the perpetrators are human. A ripple of disbelief moved through the chamber and the creche. Ambassador rose on his 4 legs, and his crystalline eyes refracting the chamber's lights into prismatic patterns impossible. He rumbled, and his voice like grinding stone, and humans are laborers and scavengers, and they lack the organization and capability for operations of this scale. We have evidence. Vexith triggered a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber, and this is chimeric. Human scavenger and wanted for the murder of 3 Varin enforcers, and we have traced his movements to 4 separate attack sites. And furthermore, we have detected anomalous behavior from human laborers across 17 sectors the images showed. Grainy surveillance footage of humans going about their daily routines, but the Vrin analysts had highlighted subtle patterns in workers who moved with fractionally more efficiency, who studied their environments with what might have been casual curiosity or might have been tactical assessment, and who were positioned at critical infrastructure points across collective territory. What you're describing is conspiracy theory. The Delthora observer hissed in her serpentine form, coiling in dismissive patterns, And you expect us to believe that humans, who could barely maintain their own planet, have orchestrated a multi-sector insurgency? Vexith's mandibles spread. In frustration, and we are requesting Council authorization to implement enhanced security measures across all human populations, and including neural scanning and, if necessary, temporary containment. The chamber erupted in debate, and some species supported the Vrin position, but others raised concerns about the precedent of imprisoning an entire population without concrete evidence, and the humans had been defeated 3 centuries ago. Their world broken, and their people scattered, and the idea that they posed a genuine threat seemed absurd, while the Council argued. Kai was 3 sectors away and infiltrating a Vrin weapons depot on the moon of Talgrith Prime and is stolen. Security credentials got him past the first 3 checkpoints, and his knowledge of Vrin security protocols, pulled from the archives, carried him past the next 4th depot, stored enough antimatter warheads to glass a planet. But Kai was not interested in the weapons themselves, and he was interested in the shipment logs, the records of where every piece of Vrin military hardware went, and who authorized its movement, and the archives had taught him that intelligence was more valuable than explosives, and that patient men won longer wars than angry ones. He copied the data in 17 minutes, and was gone before the guards completed their next rotation, and the data revealed something the Vrin had worked hard to keep secret, and they were stockpiling weapons in the border sectors. Far more than they needed for normal security operations, and they were preparing for something. Kai transmitted his findings through the Reaper network and felt the strange sensation of other minds touching his 47 consciousnesses linked through quantum encrypted channels that the galaxy's best communications technology could not detect, and they shared information instantaneously. Each Reaper's discoveries adding to the collective knowledge. Basara Chen reported that labor colony populations were being quietly increased, not through new captures, but through transfers from agricultural worlds where humans had some measure of freedom, and James Coe discovered that Vrin overseers were conducting genetic surveys, collecting DNA samples from human workers with no explanation, and Liu Wei found classified documents discussing the human problem and proposals that made Kai's blood run cold. The collective was debating extinction not publicly, not through council channels, but in private meetings between high command and select politicians who believed that the safest path forward was to eliminate humanity entirely before they could become a genuine threat, and the attacks had accelerated the timeline, and what might have taken decades was now being seriously discussed for implementation. Within months, Guy called a council of Reapers through the neural link, and they gathered in virtual space, their minds meeting in a construct that felt like the command center. It was designed to represent their planning to kill us all. Sarah's virtual presence was calm, but her anger bled through the link, and we need to strike harder and faster. No. Kai responded, and his tactical implants, running scenarios faster than conscious thought could follow, and that's what they expect. And if we escalate to open warfare, Council will back the Vrin, and we'll be fighting 43 species instead of 1. So what do we do? James asked, in his virtual form, pacing with barely contained energy. And we can't hide forever, and eventually they'll find us. We change the narrative, Kai said, and began sharing his plan through the link the next day. Footage began appearing on the galactic net, and not propaganda or manifestos, but simple documentary evidence of human conditions in Vrin territory and the medical experiments conducted on human subjects without consent, and the labor quotas that worked humans to death in months, and the casual cruelty of overseers who saw their charges as less than animal. Sky had been recording everything for weeks, and so had every other Reaper, and they had 3 centuries of abuse documented from 100 different sources, and the galaxy could ignore human suffering when it was abstract, but seeing it in high definition. Watching children work 18-hour shifts in toxic environments, and watching the elderly beaten for moving too slowly, and watching the casual disregard for human life, made it harder to dismiss. The council was forced to respond, and investigations were launched, and the Vrin protested that the footage was taken out of context or digitally altered, but forensic analysis confirmed authenticity in other species, began asking uncomfortable questions about their own labor practices to species, the Fenric Compact and the Lutherian Assembly. Formally condemned human treatment and called for reforms, and it was not much, but it was a crack in the unified front. And Kai and the Reapers worked that crack like the experienced insurgents they were becoming. The attacks continued, but their nature shifted, and instead of destroying infrastructure, the Reapers began exposing corruption and revealing how Vryn officials embezzled funds meant for colony maintenance, and how enforcement officers ran illegal smuggling operations, and how the entire system was rotten from the inside. Each revelation made the collective look weaker and more vulnerable and other subjugated. Species began to wonder if humans were really the problem, or if the Vryn had simply maintained power through brutality and deception for so long that everyone had forgotten. To question it, Commander Zelix found herself fighting a war on two fronts and trying to stop the attacks while also managing a public relations disaster that grew worse with each passing day, and she had finally tracked Kai to the Mordith sector. But when her forces arrived, he was gone, and the human labor population had vanished with him. 300 humans, liberated from the mining colonies and transported to locations unknown, and it should have been impossible to move that many people without detection, but somehow the Reapers had done it, and Zelix began to understand something that made her mandibles click. In unconscious fear, humanity had not spent 3 centuries as slaves, and they had spent 3 centuries infiltrating every level of galactic society, in learning every system and every weakness and every exploitable flaw, and now they were using that knowledge with devastating efficiency. Vryn were not fighting scattered terrorists, and they were fighting a coordinated military operation, conducted by a species that had perfected insurgency warfare over 10,000 years of killing each other, and who understood patience and sacrifice in ways that the peaceful galactic species had forgotten. Kai stood on the bridge of a stolen transport and watched the freed humans settling into their new hiding place deep in an unmapped asteroid field, and they were tired and scared and angry. But they were free, and that was a start through the neural link. He felt the other Reapers working their operations, and Sarah sabotaging communications networks, and James organizing resistance cells, and Liu Wei distributing intelligence to species who were beginning to question Vryn, authority. The galaxy had ridiculed humanity for being self-destructive and for fighting endless wars and for never achieving the enlightened peace that other species found so icily. They had not understood that those wars were not a weakness, but a terrible education, and every conflict and every defeat and every victory had taught humanity something about how to fight and how to survive and how to win when winning seemed impossible. The council was still debating what to do about the human problem, and while they debated, the Reapers were dismantling the Vryn collective piece by piece, sand somewhere in the depths of space, in a dying star system that the galaxy had. The coordinates came to Kai through the archives during his 8th week of operations, and a string of numbers that resolved into a location deep in the Ash-4 wastes, a region of space so thoroughly irradiated by a dying red giant that no species bothered to chart it, and the navigation data was 300 years old, but Kai trusted it with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the neural programming that guided his every move. He made the jump alone and left the other Reapers to continue their operations while he followed a beacon only he could hear, and the journey took 6 days through progressively more hostile space and radiation levels that would have killed an unshielded human in minutes, and his Junker's shields were barely adequate, but they held. The star system appeared empty at first, and just the bloated red sun and a handful of dead rocks stripped of atmosphere by billions of years of stellar wind, and Kai was about to question the archives when his sensors detected something impossible, and a gravitic anomaly that registered as nothing more than background noise unless you knew exactly what to look with. For he followed it deeper into the system and found a moon orbiting a gas giant so far from the dying sun that it existed in perpetual twilight, and on that moon, hidden beneath electromagnetic camouflage that had run uninterrupted for 3 centuries, was Jericho Station. The facility was enormous and larger than any human construction Kai had ever seen, and carved into the moon's surface and extending kilometers into the bedrock. And as his ship approached, defense turrets that had been dormant for longer than he had been alive, suddenly tracked his approach with lethal precision, his neural implants transmitted. Authentication codes in the turrets powered down, and a docking bay opened like a mouth. In the moon's surface, and Kai guided his ship inside and found himself in a hangar that could have held 100 vessels his size. The artificial gravity engaged as soon as his ship touched down, and Kai suited up and cycled through the airlock, and found breathable atmosphere and functioning life support, and someone had been maintaining this place. A woman was waiting for him in the hangar, an old but not frail, and her gray hair pulled back in a military style that Kai recognized from the archives, and she wore a uniform that bore the insignia of the United Earth Fleet, a symbol that had not existed in 300 years. "Welcome to Jericho Station," she said, and her voice carrying an accent that Kai had only heard in historical recordings. "And I'm Admiral Diana Chen, and my family has been waiting for you too." Kai followed her through corridors that were simultaneously ancient and perfectly maintained, and Chen explained as they walked, and her ancestors had been part of the original crew, volunteers who knew they would never see Earth again, but who were willing to spend their lives maintaining humanity's final contingency. "There are 12 of us now," Chen said, "and down from the original crew of 200, but we've kept everything operational in the reactors, the shipyards, the training facilities, and we've improved them actually, and had 3 centuries to refine Project Reaper into something the original designers could barely have imagined." They reached a command center that overlooked a massive underground cavern, and Kai stopped breathing for a moment when he saw what it contained, and ships, dozens of them, hanging in the darkness like sleeping predators, and they were not large by galactic standards. No dreadnoughts or carriers. But something about their design made his tactical implants scream warnings. He did not fully understand Reaper-class strike vessels, Chen said with quiet pride, and designed around a single principle: asymmetric warfare. Taken to its logical extreme, and they're not meant to fight fair or win battles through superior firepower, and they're meant to hunt. She brought up a holographic display that showed the ship's specifications, and their drives were modified for silent running, able to operate without the energy signatures that made conventional vessels easy to track, and their hulls used adaptive camouflage that could mimic asteroids or debris or empty space, and their weapons were not massive cannons but precision instruments, designed for surgical strikes against specific targets. Each ship requires a Reaper-linked crew of 7. Chen continued, and the neural network allows them to coordinate with a precision that's impossible for conventional crews, and they don't just share information. They share instinct and reflex and combat awareness, and they fight like wolves. In one mind distributed across multiple bodies, Kai felt his implants analyzing the data and understanding things. His conscious mind was still processing, in these ships would change everything because the galaxy's military doctrine was built around large fleets engaging in set piece battles with clear lines and rules of engagement. In these vessels could ignore all of that and strike from nowhere and vanish before retaliation was possible, and wage a kind of warfare that the Council species had never experienced. "How many Reapers do we have active?" Kai asked, "and already doing the math, 47, including yourself." Chen replied, "And enough to crew 6 vessels with some redundancy, and not enough to fight the entire Vryn fleet, but enough to make them understand what they're dealing with." She led him deeper into the station and showed him training facilities, where her small crew had maintained their readiness through endless simulations, and medical bays equipped with technology to repair or replace nearly any injury, in archives that made the data Kai had accessed look like a children's book. The original designers knew they were sending humanity to the edge of extinction, Chen said, and as they walked past memorial walls covered with names of the dead, and they wanted to ensure that if we survived, we would never be vulnerable again. And Project Reaper is not just about fighting back, and it's about transformation. She showed him the neural enhancement technology and systems far more advanced than the implants the sleeper agents carried, and these could link entire crews into a collective consciousness that operated beyond the speed of normal thought and making decisions and executing maneuvers that would be impossible for individuals acting alone. There's a cost. Chen warned, in her expression grave, and the deeper the link, the harder it is to separate afterward, and crews that fight together like this for extended periods become something that's not quite individual humans anymore, and they retain their personalities and their autonomy, but they're also permanently aware of each other in ways that can be disturbing. Kai thought about the neural link he already shared with the other Reapers and the strange intimacy of touching other minds and multiplying, that by the intensity of combat and by crews living in each other's heads for weeks or months, and he could see how it would change people in fundamental ways. The designers considered this acceptable, Chen said, in reading his expression, and because the alternative was extinction. She took him to her office and pulled up intelligence reports her crew had been monitoring for 3 centuries and watching the galaxy and compiling information about the Council's species and their military capabilities and their political structures and their weaknesses. The Vrin are planning genocide, Chen said flatly, and we've intercepted their encrypted communications, and they've concluded that humans are too dangerous to allow to survive. And they're building support in the Council for a final solution. Kai felt cold fury settle into his bones. And how long do we have? Months at most, Chen said. And they're moving slowly because they want legal authorization, but they're committed to the course, and if we don't act soon, there won't be any humans left to save. She pulled up a tactical display showing Vrin force deployments, and their fleets concentrating near human population centers and their weapons platforms being positioned for maximum coverage, and their political operatives working the council chambers to build consensus. We have 2 options, Chen said, and her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the weight of the decision. And we continue your insurgency strategy and hope that diplomatic pressure forces the Vrin to back down, and it's the safer choice and the one that might allow humanity to survive without becoming the galaxy's nightmare, and/or we activate the fleet and prove to every species in council space that humans are not to be trifled with, and that path leads to fear and probably isolation, but it guarantees survival. Kai studied the displays and his tactical implants, running scenarios and playing out possible futures, and the insurgency strategy had a 47% chance of success, and depending on factors mostly beyond their control and the fleet activation, had an 89% chance of securing human survival, but at the cost of transforming humanity's position in the galaxy. From slaves to something much more dangerous, what do you recommend? He asked. Chen smiled sadly, and I've spent my entire life maintaining this station and preparing for a war I hoped would never come, but I'm a soldier, not a diplomat, and so I'll tell you what my grandmother told me and what her grandmother told her. Humans survived 10,000 years of warfare, not by being the strongest or the smartest, but by being the ones willing to do whatever it took, and the galaxy ridiculed us for that and called us primitive and self-destructive, but they never understood that it made us the most dangerous species alive.
Oh.
She pulled up images of the labor colonies and of human children. The Vrin fleet dropped out of hyperspace in formation, and 12 capital ships and 37 support vessels, and enough firepower to reduce Jericho Station to radioactive dust, and Admiral Vexith stood on the command deck of her flagship and watched the tactical displays with satisfaction. In the humans' hidden base had been found, and now it would be eliminated, and with it the last organized resistance to the collective's authority. All ships, battle formation, Vexith commanded, and her mandibles spreading in anticipation, and prepare to commence bombardment on my mark below on Jericho Station. Kai stood in the command center and watched the same displays with a calmness that came from his tactical implants, running scenarios faster than fear could form, and 6 Reaper vessels were launched, their crews connected through the neural link with an intimacy that made them extensions of each other, and 42 humans thinking and fighting as 6 coordinated units, and each ship was commanded by a Reaper whose consciousness expanded to encompass every crew member and every system and every weapon. They outnumber us 8-1, Chen said, and standing beside him, and standard military doctrine says we should surrender. Good thing we don't follow standard military doctrine, Kai replied, in his consciousness already reaching out through the neural link to touch the minds of his strike crews, and he could feel Sarah Chen commanding Reaper 1 and James Ko on Reaper 3, and dozens of other minds he had come to know through months of shared operations through the link. They were not separate people anymore, and they were a distributed intelligence that thought in ways individual minds could not match, and Kai felt his consciousness expanding and understanding the tactical situation not as data, but as a living thing with flows and vulnerabilities and opportunities, all Reaper vessels. Engage, Kai said, in his voice carrying through the link to every crew member simultaneously. The Reaper ships moved, and they did not charge forward like conventional warships, but scattered in 6 different directions, and their adaptive camouflage, making them nearly invisible and their drives running silent, and the Vrin sensors struggled to track them. What are they doing? Exith's tactical officer clicked in confusion, and they're not maintaining formation, and they're acting independently targeting solutions. Vexith ordered, but she felt unease creeping along her neural pathways because the humans were not behaving like any enemy she had fought before. Report 1. Dove toward a Vrin support vessel and did not engage with weapons, but instead launched a spread of decoys that registered on sensors as antimatter warheads, and the Vrin ship panicked and broke formation and deployed countermeasures and exposed its flank to Reaper 3, which emerged from behind an asteroid, and put a railgun round through the vessel's reactor housing valve. Explosion took out 2 nearby ships that had moved to support their companion there, using our own tactics against us. Vexith's tactical officer reported, and his plates rattling with stress and fainting. Baiting us into vulnerable positions, Reaper 4 and Reaper 6 worked in perfect coordination in their crews, minds linked so deeply that they operated as a single entity with 2 bodies, and they wove through the Vrin formation, and their weapons firing not at random, but at specific points that their shared tactical analysis identified as critical vulnerabilities and fuel lines. Sensor arrays, communication relays, and each shot was placed with surgical precision. The Vrin tried to adapt, and their ships were powerful, and their crews experienced. But they were fighting an enemy that thought faster than they could react. And the Reaper crews did not need to communicate through channels or wait for orders to propagate through command structures, and they knew what each other would do before they did it because they were thinking the same thoughts simultaneously. Kai felt the battle through 42 pairs of eyes and made decisions that incorporated input from every Reaper simultaneously. And when Reaper 2 took damage from a lucky hit, he felt the pain echo through the link, but also felt the tactical opportunity it created, and Reaper 2's damaged state drew 3 Vrin ships into pursuit and right into the firing solutions of Reaper 5 and Reaper 1. Concentrate fire on the lead vessel, Vexith ordered, in trying to establish some semblance of control, and if we can destroy one of their ships, the others will break. But the humans did not break, and when Reaper 2's reactor went critical and the crew knew they were dying, did not panic or try to save themselves, and instead they plotted a collision course with the nearest Vrin capital ship and transmitted their final tactical analysis to the rest of the fleet, and thanked their fellow Reapers for the privilege of fighting alongside them, and then they rammed the Vrin flagship at relativistic speed. The explosion was visible across 3 star systems. Vexith's second command died in the blast along with 400 crew members, and Vexith herself survived, only because she had been in the reinforced command deck, but half her fleet was suddenly in disarray, and ships scrambling to reform while trying to track enemies that refused to fight like proper warships. They sacrificed themselves. Her tactical officer whispered, in his voice carrying horror, and deliberately, and they knew they would die, all ships. Tactical retreat, Vexith ordered, in recognizing that she was not fighting soldiers, but something else entirely, and something that approached warfare with a mindset she could not counter. But the Reaper vessels did not pursue, and instead, they harried the retreat and picking off damaged ships and destroying communication arrays and ensuring that the Vrin fleet's withdrawal was as costly and chaotic as possible. The battle lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, the Vrin had lost 19 ships, and humanity had lost 1, but those 7 crew members had taken a capital ship and 6 support vessels with them, and their sacrifice had saved Jericho Station and proven something that made Vexith's mandibles click in unconscious fear. Humans did not fight wars the way other species did, and they fought with a willingness to sacrifice that bordered on insanity. and with a coordination that seemed impossible, and with tactics that treated every convention of warfare as a suggestion to be ignored. The surviving Vryn ships jumped out of the system, and Vexith knew she needed to report to High Command. But she also knew what her report would mean, and humanity was not defeated, and they were not broken. And they were more dangerous than anyone had imagined on Jericho Station. Kai felt the neural link slowly contracting as the battle rush faded, and felt the grief for Reaper 2's crew mixing with grim satisfaction at the victory and through the link. He felt the same mixture in every surviving Reaper in mourning, and triumph in the terrible knowledge that they had changed something fundamental. The Vryn will come back, Chen said, and pulling up long-range sensor data, and next time they'll bring more ships, let them, Kai said, and his consciousness still expanded enough to feel the potential of what the Reaper fleet could become, and we've proven we can. Fight them, and now we need to prove we're willing to negotiate. He transmitted a message through channels. The Vryn could not ignore an encrypted but obvious and offering a meeting between Kai and the Galactic Council with terms for ending the conflict. The Council convened 3 days later, and this time with genuine urgency, because the Battle of Jericho Station had been witnessed by merchant vessels. Passing through nearby systems, and footage was spreading across the galactic net and showing human ships moving with impossible coordination and sacrificing themselves without hesitation and fighting with a ferocity that made the peaceful Council species deeply uncomfortable. Kai arrived at Axis Prime in a Reaper vessel and demanded to address the full Council, and security forces surrounded the chamber, but no one tried to stop him, because everyone wanted to hear what the human who had orchestrated the insurgency had to say. He stood at the central podium where Vexith had stood weeks earlier and looked out at representatives from 43 species and spoke in Galactic Standard with a clarity that came from his neural enhancements 3 centuries ago. You found humanity at our lowest point, and you saw a species tearing itself apart, and you decided we were primitive and unworthy of sovereignty. And you were wrong. He triggered a holographic display that showed the Battle of Jericho Station and the Reaper vessels moving with inhuman coordination, and the sacrifice of Reaper 2. And the devastating effectiveness of tactics the galaxy had never encountered. You thought our wars made us weak, Kai continued, in his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, and you did not understand that those wars were our education, and every conflict taught us something about how to survive and how to fight and how to win against impossible odds. And you enslaved us thinking we would accept it, and you tried to kill us thinking we could not resist, and you were wrong about all of it. The chamber was silent, and species that had dismissed humanity for 3 centuries now seeing something in Kai's eyes that made them deeply uncomfortable, and the cold certainty of a predator that knew exactly how dangerous it was. We are offering you one chance to avoid what comes next, Kai said, in full sovereignty for humanity and immediate release of all human populations from servitude and reparations for 3 centuries of abuse, and in exchange we will stand down our operations, and we will shaw